Hello, good morning. My name is Kim Richter, and I'm a senior research specialist at the Getty Research Institute and one of the organizers of this conference, together with Daniela Bleichmar from USC. And we are thrilled to welcome you today to our second day of our conference, Indigenous Knowledge and the Making of Colonial Latin America. We had a wonderful start to the whole show. Oh, now it's getting lighter. This is better, so I can see who's here. We had a really great start yesterday, despite, of course, the fires and the uncertainty of whether this event was going to be able to take place here or not. We're thrilled that we could have it here, and that the fires around the areas are pretty much contained, or at least in a much better shape, so that this area is secure. We had come up with a whole alternative plan to move the whole symposium to USC, and we're grateful to everybody at USC for coming up with this plan B in a very short amount of time. And two key people, we've mentioned them yesterday numerous times, Amy Braden and Chelsea Larkin, here from USC and from the Getty. From here and USC, they worked really tirelessly to come up with this plan B so that we could hold the conference regardless. We wanted to for sure hold this conference because we know that we had some good responses, and some of you have come from out of town, so we didn't want to let you down. And of course, we have our wonderful speakers, and we were really looking forward to the dialogue between them. So without further ado, let's begin. And it's my pleasure to introduce Xochitl Flores-Marcial from Cal State University Northridge, who will be our first moderator for today. Thank you.
Sakchi, buenos días, and good morning. Zapotec, Spanish, and English. I'd like to welcome you today and thank you for making the effort to be here. I'm introducing Dr. Bleichmar, who is Associate Professor in the Departments of Art History and History at the University of Southern California, where she also serves as Provost for Faculty and Student Initiatives in the Arts and Humanities. Her work examines the history of visual culture and the natural sciences in Europe and the Spanish Americas in the 16th through 19th centuries. She is the author of many articles and publications, one of which is Visible Empire, Botanical Expeditions, and the Visual Culture in the Hispanic Enlightenment. Dr. Bleichmar also organized an exhibit, a beautiful exhibit at the Huntington titled Visual Voyages, Images of Latin American Nature from Columbus to Darwin. Dr. Bleichmar, along with Kim Richter, thank you so much for all the work that you've done to organize and make this happen today. I welcome you and welcome everyone as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Xochitl. Good morning. So I would like to begin with a blank page. In Mexico City, in around 1541, 1542, an Aztec artist sat down, put pen and ink and brush and color washes to paper, and depicted two men sitting down, gathered around the very act that occupied him, painting. The artist unmistakably identified the men as indigenous. They were the native tilmatli, a cape or cloak. Sorry, I want to keep track of time because I can go on. Tied with a knot over one arm, in this case, a simple and unadorned white garment that the artist has marked with thin curving black lines and shaded with a purplish gray wash to suggest the draping of the fabric. Their ethnicity is also indicated by their fair feet, their lack of beard, their straight black haircut in a bob below the ears, all visual markers of indigeneity at this time. The man on the left sits on a petatl, a reed mat, indicating his seniority or higher status over the man facing him. He's a tlacuilo, a Nahuatl word that is commonly translated as painter/scribe to capture the dual nature of icon script pictorial writing. The Tlacuilo grasps in his right hand a reed pen, and on his left hand a square surface, which he has fully covered in red. With a reed pen and black ink, he has drafted an internal square frame surrounding two large comma shapes that originate diagonally from opposite corners. These figures are echoed by the small turquoise-colored comma shapes that emerge from the men's mouths, unfurling toward each other. These symbols are, of course, I don't need to tell this audience, the Nahua pictographic glyph for speech, indicating that the two men are engaged in conversation. What they are discussing is picture making itself. This is an art lesson. There's another element to this scene, one for which the Nahua artist is not responsible. Soon after he painted it, a scribe added alphabetic glosses above the figures, identifying them in Spanish as pintor, or painter, and hijo del pintor, son of the painter. The painted image, the spoken word, and the written word come together on paper to compose a statement concerning both artistic practice and the transmission of knowledge. The father is communicating knowledge to his son through physical demonstration and spoken word. Whatever this knowledge may be, however, technological, artistic, intellectual, social, familial, it is a thing of the past. The artist who produced this vignette in the early 1540s, 2 decades after the fall of the Mexica Empire, was involved in the work of the historian recalling a bygone era, not that of the ethnographer reporting on the present. The certain proof of that is the textual gloss, which translates a native technology into a colonial technology, and native categories into colonial categories. The Mesoamerican concept of tlacuiloli, which encompasses not only painting/writing, but also books/paintings, as well as various kinds of knowledge and wisdom, becomes painting. The tlacuilo becomes a painter. There is an act of translation that is not only linguistic, but also epistemic and ontological. The artist who painted these figures depicted a scene from the pre-contact past in which a Nahua artist created a pre-Hispanic codex, which he himself lived while he himself lived in a colonial present and created a colonial document that we know today as the Codex Mendoza. And the detail I've been focusing on is here. We've seen this image by now quite a few times. What did it mean to draw, to paint, to make a book in Mexico City so soon after the conquest? At a time when the meaning of painting, writing, bookmaking, and knowledge-making were being rethought and their possibilities actively explored by both indigenous peoples and Europeans, how did Nahuas and Spaniards navigate collaboration without consensus, working with one another while having contesting understandings about the meanings of images, the relationships to words, the epistemic possibilities of each, and of spoken and written language? Can we approach this image and this manuscript not only as a depiction of knowledge about making, but also as a source for exploring knowledge in the making? And this last question is central to my enterprise. This is sort of what I want to try out here. I am interested in approaching the manuscript not as a fully formed, finished, stable object that transmits knowledge, though of course it is that too, but rather as an object that is made to examine the process through which it is crafted for what that process can tell us about what knowledge was understood to be and how knowledge making worked. I hope that is clear. If not, I hope it will become so. At the time the Codex Mendoza was made, Aztec pictorial manuscripts and the act of painting itself held a fraught, polemical, indeed incendiary status. As this audience will know, before the arrival of Europeans to the Americas, the Nahuas of central Mexico, like the Mixtecs and the Maya, possessed a sophisticated tradition of pictographic writing and produced manuscripts that were repositories of precious knowledge. And many of you were here for Davide's presentation yesterday, so some of this, you will have heard, but not everyone in the audience was here yesterday. So pre-Columbian manuscripts, known today as codices, regardless of whether they are, in fact, in the codex format, often took the form of screen folds, like the one you see on the screen. This is, of course, a facsimile, so a copy of the Codex Cospi in the GRI reading room. But you can see that when fully folded, it collapses into a square that is 7 by 7 inches. This is exactly what the artist of the Codex Mendoza depicted in the painting lesson we just examined. The red and the black hues, of course, were indeed dominant in pre-Hispanic codices and have important metaphoric meanings. While these manuscripts recorded information and narratives in painted form, the pictorial register was not intended to function on its own. Rather, those who had access to them, especially the temple priests and the tlamatinime, the wise ones, would unfold the work and perform the painting as spoken word or song. So painting gave way to orality, to speech or to song. And this oral component is one that remains in the Codex Mendoza, as I will explain. After contact, Spaniards quickly realized the existence and significance of what they called painted books, or sometimes simply paintings. Conquistadors and missionaries understood that indigenous painted books were part of religious beliefs, and for this reason considered them idolatrous and horrifying, the work of the devil, as they considered native religion. For Spaniards, Mesoamerican pictorial manuscripts were often tinged with horror and disgust. And so, as part of their war against the devil, conquistadors and missionaries burned the vast majority of pre-Columbian codices as depicted in this colonial manuscript made in central Mexico in the 1580s. The Franciscan Diego de Landa, one of the fiercest warriors in this religious war, wrote of his experience with the Maya in Yucatan in the early 1560s. Quote, "We found a great number of books in these letters, and since they contain nothing but superstitions and falsehoods of the devil, we burned them, which they took most grievously, and which gave them great pain." Landa claimed to have overseen the burning of 20,000 statues and 40 Maya pictorial manuscripts. This, famously, in the words of Serge Gruszinski, was a war of images. As a result of this ferocious battle against Mesoamerican culture, only a small number of codices, of pre-contact codices, are known to have survived, none from the Aztec. So in the middle of this destruction and in a period of dramatic, often vexed cultural transformation, the pre-Columbian painter-scribes, the Tlacuiloque, reinvented themselves and were reconfigured into colonial artists. They continued to paint, adding to their repertoire new materials, such as oil paintings, European paper, pigments, new pictorial techniques, style, and iconography. In the early decades after the conquest, manuscript painters combined indigenous and European traditions and continued to produce pictorial manuscripts for various uses by indigenous communities, by the colonial administrative system, and in some cases for export to Europe. And I think that this intended mobility of the object is something that matters greatly. This was the case with the Codex Mendoza, which was made to record and communicate native history and traditions to Spanish audiences at a time when that history was changing rapidly and dramatically, and those traditions were being ferociously persecuted. The Codex is an illustrated manuscript in the format of a European-style book, a codex. It's composed of 71 folios of European paper, each page measuring roughly 30 by 21 centimeters. Of the total 142 pages, 72 are predominantly pictorial, such as the folio you see on the right of the screen, and 63 consist of textual commentary in Spanish. I'm going to go super quickly. I imagine many of you know this, but the codex is divided in 3 distinct sections. So the first section, this doesn't like me. Okay. The first section occupies a total of 16 folios, roughly a fourth of the entire content, and it presents a history of the Aztecs, beginning with the founding of the capital city of Tenochtitlan, which you see depicted on the right, and ending with the end of Moctezuma's reign. History begins with the mythical origin of the empire, and from there proceeds chronologically, one by one, through the reigns of 9 emperors. Year glyphs illuminated in brilliant turquoise provide the dates for the ruler's reign. And we also have the figure of the seated ruler and the signs for warfare and the individual towns that the emperor brought into the imperial fold through military victory. Mexica history is thus presented as an imperial history marked by the succession of military triumphs. And every single figure is individually annotated with a Spanish textual gloss. So as you can see, every single element on the page is labeled. The image always gets this companion text. The second section of the manuscript, which we saw yesterday in person at the exhibition, not something one can say every day, deals with economics, tribute obligations of different towns and regions. And it is the longest of the three parts of the book. It comprises 39 folios, which is almost exactly twice as long as the first section and a bit more than half of the entire manuscript. And each spread details a tribute paid or due by the town subject to Aztec rule in a given region. The section itemizes individual places and individual objects, such as feathers, animal skins, precious stones, gold, mantles, liquid amber, cacao beans, and so on. The third section, the final one, is 16 folios long, equivalent in size to the first one. And while the first section relates to standard Mesoamerican genres of dynastic history, and the second one is connected to at least one other document, the Matrícula de Tributos, the third section represents a colonial innovation, an account of Aztec life and customs. It begins with the birth of a child. You can see here the newborn creature. Details the upbringing of boys and girls, practices of education, war, diplomacy, administration. This is not responding. Okay. And the trades, including our painters. So that is information in the Codex Mendoza, right? We were talking yesterday about these sources and seeing them as different kinds of archives. And one archive is the archive of information, of data, of the content that we can obtain from these sources. But when we turn to the last folio of the manuscript, okay, here's the painter, sorry. So the last folio. The work concludes with a page of text in which the Spanish scribe addresses the reader, providing invaluable information about the making of the manuscript and the aspects that a Spanish participant in its manufacture considered significant. The scribe frames the production of the manuscript in terms of translation. He begins by asking the reader for leniency regarding the style of the prose, which he describes as grosero, rough, or coarse, explaining that due to time pressure, the interpretation was done a uso de proceso, that is, according to legal conventions. And I think that is incredibly important. This is not a manuscript that is produced in a conventual context. It is produced in a legalistic setting. The scribe then points out mistranslations, noting that the interpreter mistakenly used the word alfaqui, a Spanish word of Arabic origin, when he should have used sacerdote, or priest, the word mezquita, mosque, when he should have used temple. And so this highlights that the translation was not only linguistic but also cultural, and that, as we know from many Spanish chronicles, New World belief was often approached through Old World perspectives that linked the conquista of New Spain to the reconquista of Old Spain, the fight against American religion to the Spanish combat against Islam. The scribe concludes by blaming the indigenous makers for the rush, and tells the reader that the Spanish prose can be trusted despite its unpolished style because the interpreter is, quote, well-versed in the Mexican language. So there is a reassurance about the truthfulness of the account, as well as an indication that the person responsible for providing the textual meaning was a Nahuatl-speaking Spanish interpreter. So in this attention to translation, the scribe who composed the last page of the Codex provides us with very important information to deduce the intricate process through which the Codex was made, a process that involves sequential translations. And so I want to use this statement to unlock the process of making the Codex, and that is what I mean by contrasting the knowledge in the Codex to the Codex as a way to examine knowledge in the making. So if we go back to the blank page, this is how this process began. Blank sheets of European paper folded given to a Nahua master painter working for a Spanish patron who painted the images on the 72 pages, leaving blank pages in between. And based on a meticulous examination of the images, Jorge Gomez Tejada has concluded that at least 2 artists painted these images. They worked on a rather new format, the rectangular page that is turned sequentially, a major shift in pictorial practice. And while continuing to deploy long-standing indigenous pictorial conventions, such as the speech glyphs, the reed mats, the use of the bright turquoise blue, many others, the work also demonstrates how quickly and deftly indigenous artists took up European elements. For instance, the proportions of the human figures, a style that is more naturalistic than abstract when compared to pre-Columbian painting and many other aspects. So this was the first step. In it, the image holds all the meaning. There's a second step in which drawings are used as a basis for an oral narrative in Nahuatl. We do not know if the speakers are the painters themselves or if others were brought in to perform the images as spoken word. The text does not give this information, but what we do know is that this is a continuation of an indigenous practice of making of enacting image into spoken word, albeit transformed, as the oral component has now become a decipherment of the image, an image that would otherwise be unreadable in the colonial context for the Spanish participants. The work that images do and the work that the words do have changed. The first act of translation, of transforming painted image into spoken word, was one performed by the Nahua participants. The third step in making the codex involved another act of translation, also oral, the transformation of the spoken Nahuatl into spoken Spanish. And this is the work of the person identified as el interpretador, the interpreter. And then there's a fourth step in which the Spanish scribe sets down the Spanish oral interpretation as a set of, as extensive text and also as glosses, annotating each individual drawing. And then there's a fifth and final step that involves verification and correction. So you can see up here that a word has been crossed out and another word written in top. So the word ocho has been crossed out and says written on top. And at the bottom of the page, there's another inscription that records and validates that correction. It's saying where there was 8 that was crossed out, it now says 6, this is accepted. And this is, of course, part of the practice of the notarial legal scribe, where every correction to the text needs to be validated. So what I'm suggesting is that the Codex Mendoza can be understood as a result of a series of translations, from the image to the spoken word, from the spoken word to the written word, from Nahuatl to Spanish, from pictographic writing to alphabetic writing, as well as hermeneutic translations that interpret the information about the Aztec past within the new colonial context, and I'll note some of them shortly. These multiple translations left traces that provide evidence of the decisions, the frictions, the telling details that allow us to explore the cultural interpretation and negotiation involving making and looking at images, books, and knowledge. And yesterday, after the fabulous papers and discussion we had, I went home and I was thinking about the discussion and how we think about these objects. A question was asked saying, well, we used to use the word hybrid, we no longer use it. What categories can we employ to think about this? What is useful for us? So I have, a last-minute addition where I was wondering whether a concept from science studies can help us. I'm trained as a historian of science, and I have come to think of the production of knowledge and of technology as very capable categories, where knowledge of the natural world or technology in the ways we normally think of them can be expanded to many different kinds of practices. I am, of course, not alone in this. But the idea of the boundary object, I thought, might be helpful here. And this is a concept that was introduced quite some time ago, in the late 1980s, by the sociologist of science Susan Starr and the philosopher of science James Griesemer. And they came up with this concept of a boundary object, which they defined as an object which lives in multiple social worlds and has different identities in each. The idea was that when you have different communities of practice that are engaging with each other, they need objects that can be shared, that can satisfy the informational requirements of each of the communities. And so boundary objects are objects that are both plastic enough to adapt to local needs and constraints of the several parties employing them, but also robust enough to maintain a common identity across sites. So they are weakly structured in common use and become strongly structured in individual site use. And key to this idea was the concept of translation, and as articulated by, theorized by Michel Calon and Bruno Latour when looking at scientific objects. But I think that this idea can maybe help us, because the idea is that you have intersecting communities, and they have objects, and I'm using the word object very as an idea rather than a concrete object. Almost anything can be an object. But it can be an arrangement that allows different groups to work together without consensus. So the idea is not the object as a thing, but as a set of actions, as a set that allow different actors to share enough of an understanding of something to function, but to have basically very different needs, uses, understandings of that thing. So I'm going to see if this helps us think about the hermeneutic translations in the Codex Mendoza. So we see the focus on translation from the very first painted folio. The relation between text and image is not one of content and illustration. Rather, they both provide information in two separate systems, a Mexica one of pictorial writing and a Spanish one of alphabetic writing. And I think this is really important. I think we're so conditioned to see something that looks like a book, that has images and that has words, and to understand the words as a text and the image as an illustration. And here we don't have that. We have two texts. One happens to be alphabetic and one happens to be pictorial. The Spanish text has a dual function. First, to translate content, to convey in text the information that the image presents, but also the second function is to translate the way in which the system itself operates. And this is something that made this particular manuscript enormously valuable to readers from the 16th century to the present. It has been used as a sort of Rosetta Stone, allowing people to learn to read the pictorial writing. And this is most clearly evidence here. This was already mentioned yesterday, though in a different context, where you have a glossing of the system itself. The translation is incessant, repetitive, even redundant. Every single image is annotated with an alphabetic clause that translates it, while the text on the facing page repeats the exact same information, so that in effect, every image is translated not once but twice. So we will see a gloss here saying what this is, and then again here. in addition to this repetition, every single glyph is translated every single time it appears, even if it recurs within the folio or from folio to folio. The translation just never stops. It is never assumed that the reader already knows that a banner stands for 20 or that a burning temple denotes conquest, even if there are dozens and dozens of nearly identical figures. Every single one is identified with the alphabetic label. And this, to me, suggests the professional obligation, the professional and obligatory precision of the legal context in which the translation took place. This is more than information, it is evidence. Another type of translation involves a framing of Nahua culture in ways that are relevant in the colonial context, and in particular for Spanish audiences, both in Mexico and in Europe. So one example is the view of Moctezuma's palace, and our historians have noted that this image provides the only perspectival view in the codex, demonstrating the artist's engagement with European artistic technique and providing a Europeanized vision of Aztec rule. But equally significant, in my view, is the fact that both the image and the text describe the Aztecs as an example of a civilized people by celebrating what the term terms their, quote, orden, buen gobierno, buen regimiento. Order, good governance, good rulership. These are not random words. These are very specific categories in political philosophy at the time that denote their civitas. This is a critical category for European thought, and it communicates that these are a highly civilized people in recognizable terms. I want to show one last instance. There's many, many of these, but just one last example of the ways in which the Codex records the complex negotiations and reinterpretations involved in knowledge making. The first section ends with the reign of Moctezuma. At the bottom of the page, an addition of hieroglyphs in pen and ink without illumination indicates a telling editorial intervention. The year count has been extended. So here it says número de años, and first there was a Roman numeral 15, and then 3 more lines are added, and of course 3 more glyphs are added, year counts are added. The penultimate one is annotated fin y muerte de Moctezuma, end and death of Moctezuma. The last one, pacificación y conquista de la Nueva España, pacification and conquest of New Spain. And of course, again, the word pacification is not a random word, it's a very specific one that is coming from classical tradition of Roman conquest. So the scribe not only translates the image, but in this case also intervenes to present a different view of history, showing how the act of cultural translation was one of revision and transformation. So to conclude my presentation, I want to go back to our 2 painters. So I want to end with 3 points. First, and I have already suggested this, but I think it hopefully became more clear through the presentation, the artistic practice and knowledge that are being depicted here are historical. The indigenous artist who in the early 1540s represented an indigenous painter and his son depicted a scene from the past, not the present, the production of a pre-Columbian pictorial manuscript, not a colonial artist. So it is knowledge, but it is a specific kind of knowledge. It is historical knowledge. He painted an artist whose materials, techniques, figures, whose very sense of what picturing is and does, how it works, what it connects to, were all rapidly changing. This is not a self-portrait. It is a view of the past. The colonial painter was practicing what I have been thinking of as pictorial bilingualism, painting figures and traditions from Aztec culture while using new pictorial conventions emerging from the combination of Aztec and Spanish practices. The second point is that the epistemic implications of pictorial knowledge have also been transformed, and Davide was talking about this yesterday. The image shows the making of a codex using black and red. This is clearly an allusion to the Nahuatl phrase, Intlilin Tlapali, the black ink, the red ink. And this is how the pictorial writing was denoted, and more broadly, knowledge itself. Tlacuiloli, what can be translated as picture writing, is actually that, and other things as well. It has been described as part of the sacred body of knowledge possessed by sages before the beginning of time. To paint was not to represent, but instead to invoke and materialize the most precious sacred knowledge about the natural and the supernatural, and to awaken the flowery song. This understanding of painting is not articulated in the text, which through translation transforms the Tlacuilo into a painter, knowledge making into representation, Tlacuiloli, or sacred knowledge about the natural and the supernatural, into moral, ethical, and civic customs. So there's categorical translations. The third and final point is that the very status and epistemic possibility of the image has been reconfigured. If Aztec pictorial writing was not representation but the very embodiment of sacred knowledge, in the viceregal period it became evidence, the deposit of legal testimony and proof, not in all contexts, but I believe in this one. As you will remember, the scribe noted in his address to the reader that the interpreter worked a uso de proceso, according to legal conventions, that is, as a court interpreter. And this is incredibly important because in early colonial Mexico, there were two dominant modes in which Europeans and native peoples came together around native images, and both of them involved suspicion. One, which I have already mentioned, was the image as a locus of idolatry, demanding for Spaniards its negation and destruction. But the other was an evidentiary context in which indigenous people submitted pictorial evidence to the audiencias or law courts as parts of trials. And so, one of many examples, and there is one in the exhibition here, but one of the earliest known is the Codex Huejotzinco, 8 sheets of indigenous drawings on European paper submitted as legal evidence in a lawsuit about tribute obligations. And this is a very well-known example. It's a lawsuit brought by Spaniards against Spaniards about tribute in goods and labor paid by the indigenous inhabitants of Huejotzinco. And what is remarkable is that the indigenous people in question were not asked to testify. In fact, the lawyer for the defense expressed the impossibility of trusting the Huejotzincans, stating, quote, "All Indians in general are bad Christians, drunks, liars, idolaters, eaters of human flesh, vile persons who for anything whatsoever will perjure themselves." The definition of ad hominem, if there ever was. What did become part of the trial were the painted images. That was admissible evidence. And in his study of these images, Tom Cummings has discussed this incident to argue that in this climate of profound mistrust and uncertainty in which paintings serve to authenticate oral and written testimony, the images themselves and the shared act of seeing provided the necessary epistemic certainty. They became cultural meeting places, spaces of possibility. We know that the Codex Mendoza was produced a modo de proceso, with indigenous informants supplying pictorial evidence and an oral account in Nahuatl that a legal interpreter translated into Spanish and a scribe, probably a legal scribe, took down. So the images function as evidence, and we see the connection between making pictures and making knowledge. But I have argued that the knowledge was not located in the image itself or in the image alone, nor in the act of looking, but rather emerged from a complex series of acts of translation, each of which shaped meaning and knowledge. Thus, while I find the point about the tense, contested, even litigious cultural context in which images operated very important, I am not convinced that images in themselves or joint looking resolved the conflict. What I am proposing is that a great deal of work that can become invisible, went into determining the meanings and uses of images in this early colonial moment. Work that involved crafting them as evidence, gauging their reliability, investigating their potential for various tasks, actively selecting some aspects and disavowing others. This work entailed multiple translations, and as the painters and scribes who produced this codex show us, historical actors were finely attuned to acts and standards of translations. In this way, the Codex Mendoza allows us to examine knowledge in the making and epistemology in the making. It functions as a site of cultural transactions where makers and interpreters wrestled with various possible ways of thinking about Aztec history, society, and culture. At a fraught time of intense and often harrowing cultural transformation, they set down their understandings of the possibilities of images and words for capturing and transmitting knowledge. Thank you.
Now I will introduce Dr. Françozo, who is Assistant Professor of Museum Studies at the Faculty of Archaeology at Leiden University. Her research stands at the intersection of anthropology and history and focuses on the collection and circulation of indigenous objects and knowledge from South America to Europe. Her book, De Olinda a Holanda, O Gabinete de Curiosidades de Nassau, is a historical reconstruction and an anthropological analysis of Count Johann Moritz van Nassau's 17th century collection of curiosities. Unfortunately, Dr. Françozo cannot be here with us, but Allison Bigelow will be reading her paper.
So I have Mariana here on my phone, and we're going to try to do the same thing as yesterday and hope for the same results. Also, apologies in advance. How do I put this nicely? My pronunciation of Dutch, Latin, and Portuguese is going to be pretty bad. That should not reflect on the original author. Okay. Introduction. I would like to start by thanking Daniela Bleichmar and Kim Richter for the invitation to be part of this symposium and for this opportunity to present some of my work to you. I would like to acknowledge the fantastic work that Kim, Daniela, Amy, and Chelsea did in making sure that, despite all odds, this conference would take place. Most of all, I am thankful to Kim and for giving me shelter from the fire, to Daniela for rescuing me from the hospital, and to Allison for giving me a voice, very weird to read. You are my heroes. In this presentation, I will talk about the presence and the role of indigenous knowledge in the making of Dutch Brazil, the relatively short period in history when the Dutch West India Company attempted to, and finally succeeded in, conquering and controlling a rather large portion of Portuguese America. I zoomed in so I could look at it better. Okay. The period spanning from 1624 to 1654 is brief in comparison to the 3 centuries of Portuguese colonialism in Brazil, but it has huge implications and, as I will argue, is a particularly interesting lens through which we can think about and rewrite the indigenous history of Brazil and the history of indigenous knowledge in the making of colonial Brazil. I have organized this presentation in 2 parts. First, I want to give you a very brief overview of what was Dutch Brazil, and in doing so, I will highlight how even the most well-known historical sources about this period can still be reread, reinterpreted, and offer us more insight into indigenous participation in this part of colonial history, as well as into the Dutch dependence on Tupi knowledge for their colonial ambitions in South America, from planning the conquest to consolidating it, and ultimately losing it. This is one of the possible ways of talking about indigenous knowledge, that is, practical knowledge, knowledge of the territory, its topography, knowledge and relationships with other native peoples of Brazil, and the other colonizing powers, such as the Portuguese and the French. Knowledges of how to live in that area and how best to make political and military alliances there. There is another way to talk about knowledge, and that is to think about knowledge systems or epistemologies. In trying to explore that, in the second part of my talk, I will delve into one particular object, the book Historia Naturais Brasileira, shown here in this slide on the frontispiece, which really exemplifies the process of collecting, registering, interpreting, and ultimately publishing different aspects or pieces of Indigenous knowledge to a European audience in the mid-17th century Dutch Republic. In exploring this book, I will first look at the description of beverages made from Brazilian plants, and secondly, I will talk briefly about the possibility of reconstructing Indigenous epistemologies by looking at the Old Tupi language. Throughout my paper and in my research more broadly, I am inspired by the work of, among others, Brazilian historians and anthropologists who since more or less the 1980s have been systematically proposing creative and inclusive ways to rewrite Indigenous history in Brazil. I will talk more about these contributions in a while, but for now, let us begin with Dutch Brazil. Part 1, Knowing Brazil. So let us start with this map of Brazil. This is a manuscript chart of Brazil made by Dutch scholar Johan de Laet, probably in the early 1620s, while the plans to invade Brazil were still in development, as was the creation of the Dutch West India Company. De Laet was a scholar, a geographer, translator, humanist, but also one of the 19 directors of the West Indian Company. In both capacities, he developed a keen interest in the history, geography, and nature of the Americas, and in this case, especially of South America, where the economic and political interests of the Dutch Republic were turning during that particular phase of the 80-year War. As part of their struggle for independence from the Spanish Empire, the Dutch saw Brazil, by then also part of the Spanish Empire due to the union of the Iberian crowns, as a military target in America that could weaken the Spanish in Europe. So, Johan de Laet was very active in compiling all available nautical and topographic information, as well as the information about native peoples of Brazil, in order to prepare an attack on the country. The manuscript chart shows precisely that attempt, and there is, of course, more material that exemplifies how carefully the Dutch planned this colonial endeavor, and even more material showing how Dutch people reacted to the conquest and loss of Brazil, which is something that you can ask Mariana about in the Q&A, and she's happy to talk about it. In 1624, a large fleet of Dutch vessels arrived at the then capital of the colony, Bahia de Todos os Santos, and managed to occupy and control the city for about a year and a half, until a Portuguese-Spanish armada liberated the city. What is important about this episode is that on their way back to the Netherlands, one of the Dutch ships stopped at the Bahia de Traição, not indicated here on the map, but just between Pernambuco and Paraíba, and there they started an alliance with the Portuguese indigenous people, who were eager to find allies for their struggle against the Portuguese. That alliance was essential to the success of the second Dutch attack on Brazil, this time in Olinda, Pernambuco, in 1630. 5 Portuguese men, named here in this document, had traveled to the Netherlands with the fugitive ship in 1624, and during those 6 years in the Republic, they learned Dutch and met a number of times with Dutch authorities to discuss the strategies for the invasion of Brazil. Next to learning about the topography and geography of northeastern Brazil, an essential element of these conversations, which are sometimes called interviews in this document, was the identification of other Tupi-speaking groups who would potentially also want to ally with the Dutch invaders. The point I'd like to make here is that the preparation of the conquest relied heavily on Portuguese knowledge of the territory and Portuguese political and military tactics. All throughout the conquest, from the first phase of about 5 to 7 years of war to the second phase of relative peace under the governorship of Johan Maurits van Nassau-Siegen, to the last phase when the West India Company was basically giving up on Dutch Brazil and the Portuguese planters' revolt, with the support of enslaved African peoples, practically put an end to the Dutch ambitions in the tropics. But all throughout these 3 decades, indigenous support and indigenous knowledge were essential to the functioning of the colony. While the presence of indigenous peoples in Dutch Brazil has always been acknowledged by the historiography of the period, only very recently have scholars started to look at the historical implications of this. Recent books by Mark Mawisi and Brothers in Arms, Partners in Trade, 2012, and Wim Klooster, The Dutch Moment, 2017, are great examples of rewriting the history of Dutch Brazil, with indigenous peoples as actors in leading roles, not just tokenistic characters in supporting roles, just to throw in some LA jargon for y'all. In my own work, what I'm trying to do is to look at the cultural products of Dutch Brazil. That is, the ethnographic collections, the paintings, the maps, the books produced as a result of those 30 years, and look at how they help us rethink the influence of indigenous culture and indigenous knowledge. In the remaking of Dutch Brazil in particular, and early modern history in general. To rephrase the title of that fantastic series of volumes, Asia in the Making of Europe, I try very humbly and within my limits to think of America in the making of Europe. And in this sense, America to me stands for that brief Dutch moment that can only be understood as an interruption of the first 150 years of entanglements between native peoples, enslaved Africans, and European colonial powers in Brazil. So I am showing you this other map here by George Markgraf, also a beautiful, fantastic manuscript map, as an example of the types of materials that I work with, and also the incredible achievement of the Dutch in Brazil in producing a body of work whose legacy really does allow us to rewrite and rethink history today. These are two examples of the kinds of manuscript works that Mariana is working with, and she is happy to talk about them in the Q&A, and maybe Daniela can also explain how some of these materials end up in Visual Voyages. Now coming to the second part of my talk, I'd like to delve a bit into these materials, namely the book Historia Naturalis Brasileira, and to talk about indigenous knowledge of the natural world and indigenous epistemologies. I'm going to follow Kelly and just call this HNB. The second part of the HNB, namely Markgraf's 8 books on the botany and zoology of Brazil, includes abundant examples of how indigenous practices were translated and made comprehensible to the European readership of this book. Neil Safir argues that Markgraf's regular use of indigenous terminology in the HNB contributed toward establishing the reputation of the HNB as a reliable source. But more than just citing names, what I want us to see here is that Markgraf in fact compiled a catalog of indigenous uses of diverse plants and animals, including, importantly, the names in Old Tupi for all plants and animals described. So it's not really about asserting authority or establishing a reputation, but more about the HNB and our ability to see it as a catalog of indigenous knowledge of plants and animals in a very specific context. A legacy of 150 years of indigenous and African entanglements with Portuguese colonialism in northeast Brazil that gets interrupted by this Dutch moment, as Klooster would put it. I would also like to point out the importance of Johan de Leijt, the editor of the book, who put together Piso's book with Markgraf's notes. In fact, Markgraf had died in Angola in 1643, so his notes, sketches, and studies were sent to Johan Maurits in The Hague, and he in turn sent this material to De Leijt in Leiden so that he could translate Markgraf's notes, which he had written in a ciphered code in order to avoid Piso stealing his studies, which is maybe the classic example of early modern plagiarism. Through the hands of De Leijt, the book was transformed into a treatise of comparative botany and zoology, contrasting examples from Markgraf's work in Brazil with that of earlier scholars in Spanish America. Most of all with Jimenez, but also with Acosta, Monardes, and of course Garcia de Horta in the other side of the Portuguese Empire. Now, as we see here, the HNB also contains important information about the plants transported from West Africa and incorporated into the Brazilian environment. So the HNB, as these names suggest, is really an excellent index to cultural interactions that go beyond what we already know about the military and political alliance, as in the works of Klooster, for instance. As is relevant to the topic of this symposium, the presence of indigenous knowledge in the HNB is an indicator of the ways in which such knowledge was obtained, collected, and registered by Piso and Markgraf, and subsequently put into practical use, or not, in the Dutch colony. One of the things that stands out is the reference throughout the book to indigenous uses of plants and fruits to make beverages, and especially those that induce altered states of consciousness, which is a nice way of saying getting drunk. On one of the last pages of the HNB, the chapter about the indigenous inhabitants of Brazil, Mark Graff summarizes indigenous drinking practices by saying that they drink fresh water from the fountains or rivers. And next to that, they are very fond of heavy drinking, bebederas, and use fruits and roots to make wine. He lists 9 different types of such drinks, the most common being the caiumim, made with the fruit of the tree acaiba, the cashew tree. I may have gotten a little, next one? This? Okay, thank you. Mark Graff writes, the natives prefer to eat the nut instead of eating the fruit, from which they extract a wine. They pour the fruits in a mortar and strain the broth. Sometimes they also squeeze them with their hands and let it rest. The broth then becomes white as milk and grows pale after a few days. It is astringent and strong and intoxicating. If preserved for 6 months, it degenerates into vinegar, with a wine taste still noticeable even in the vinegar. He goes on to add, the indigenous people count the years of life with cashew nuts, keeping 1 cashew nut for each year. He also explains how the trunk of the tree is used to make larger canoes called chalupas. After the caium, Mark Graff writes about the aipi, made of manioc roots, the pacobi, the atibi, or corn wine, the nananai, made of pineapple, the atc, made of potato, the drink made of inapaba, the betingui, and finally the tepiasi, made of manioc flour. He highlights the specific modes of preparation, such as the aipi. Old women chew the roots of the manioc, then spit that mass onto a pan, adding hot water to it and letting it slowly simmer. Once it is cooked, the liquor is separated through the sifting, and the drink is drunk while lukewarm. Such detailed, even maybe ethnographic observations of modes of making beverages is also to be found in earlier chapters of the HMB, where Mark Graff describes certain trees and fruits. The atitica, forward, back? No, this one. Yes. Okay. The atica, called Kipu Anikinan Putu in the language of the Congo and batata in Portuguese, is here rendered as the indigenous people smash some fresh potatoes, mix it with water, and leave it for fermentation in order to make a drink. Ipicacunya, this drink is used as a vomitive and purgative with great results for diarrhea and other digestive problems. Sorry, it's early for the graphic descriptions. The fruit nana, or pineapple, the juice of this fruit is mixed with water and given to the stick. They also season it with sugar to conserve it. Next to the description of beverages, there was also attention to the material culture of drinking. There's a great example that Mariana can explain about calabashes. What emerges from these examples, and there are many others, is that in his writing, Mark Graff seems to have tried to make a distinction between beverages used to heal the sick, such as the pineapple juice and the ipicacaha, and those used to induce intoxication, such as the cashew juice and the fermented potato drink. This suggests that Mark Graff witnessed the use of each beverage in very particular situations, which led him to associate each drink to a certain use. Contrary to 16th century Portuguese chroniclers, who had made detailed ethnographic observations of the ritual use of alcoholic beverages among the Tupi, Mark Graff and Piso seem to have missed, or perhaps not fully comprehended, the necessity of achieving altered states of consciousness during specific community rituals. On the contrary, when writing about the Tapiuya peoples, Mark Graff describes these rituals as bebederas, almost suggesting that they drink in order to get drunk. He describes, they give themselves over to drinking, singing, and dancing without interruption. When they feel too drunk and intoxicated, they throw up in order to start drinking again. And the one who can throw up the most and then drink again the most is the best and most powerful drinker. Portuguese chroniclers such as Gabriel Soares da Souza, the Jesuit letters, and even the holy triad of European narrators of 16th century Brazil, Hans Staden, André Thevet, and Jean de Lery, had also noticed the importance of drinking rituals to the coastal Tupi populations of Brazil, and they wrote extensive accounts of that. Their writings inspired many generations of Brazilian anthropologists and historians to read these accounts and then use them to reconstruct the social structure and cosmologies of Tupinamba peoples. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology that we can use for documenting indigenous history in Brazil. Sociologist Florestan Fernandes was the pioneer of this field in the 1950s. And here we see two works by him and inspired by him. When we take a step back, we see another trend in the field, which is toward a more global historiography of indigenous knowledge. And I'd like to mention a recent article by historian of science Kapil Raj, in which he writes about the Hortus Malabaricus, another product of Dutch 17th century colonial natural history. This one in India and specifically in Malabar. Raj briefly recounts the history of production of this seminal volume, highlighting the names of scholars who informed, I think the volume is, yeah, this, okay. Highlighting the names of the scholars who informed von Reed Dreikenstein about the properties of native Indian plants. Kapil Raj states that bringing out the different voices in the text itself helps to tell a very different story. In what can be considered a manifesto against the use of the concept of scientific revolution in the history of science, he defends that historians should renew their concepts and look for relational narratives, writing, "This relational narrative involving circulations, encounters, interactions, and connections helps put non-European actors back into the story as active participants in the knowledge-making process and restores their agency." The Hortus Malabaricus is really a fantastic volume and a very interesting comparison point because it is also the product of Dutch 17th century colonialism in the tropics to the HNB. Historian Anjana Singh and I are currently writing a paper comparing those two works in terms of the presence of indigenous knowledge therein. As stated, in the HM, we can find the names of indigenous experts, which is not the case with the HNB, where we find generic terms such as the Portuguese and the Brazilian. However, such as Florestan Fernandes did, Manuela and Eduardo, and many other Brazilian scholars, we must reflect about how to find indigenous history and voices in colonial texts. For the Dutch case, the relative abundance of sources allows us, for instance, to cross-reference these nameless agents in the HNB with the whereabouts of Piso and Markgraf in the colony, though Markgraf's diary in the maps, just as the one I showed you earlier in this presentation. If we are able to reconstruct Markgraf's expeditions in the backlands of Brazil, we might be able to better understand who he was talking to. And if we delve into the archives of the West India Company, we might find the names, or at least the ethnic identities, of the indigenous allies and enemies that the Dutch interacted with. Finding indigenous agency and voices is one thing. There is no doubt that this can be done, but reconstructing indigenous epistemologies or systems of knowledge is another matter. Through a careful reading of 16th century Portuguese chroniclers, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro and Manuela Carneiro da Cunha were able to identify tropes such as the ritual transformation of human and non-human beings into each other, and with that, in combination with their fieldwork experience with Tupi-speaking peoples, to write about colonial Tupi worldviews, contradicting Florestan Fernandes' structuralist view that had dominated scholarly discourse about the Tupinamba for 30 years or more. I skipped the historiography because Manuela was going to just freestyle that, or Mariana was going to freestyle, so you should ask her about this in the Q&A. As to the Dutch, and to go back to the beverages, what is striking to me is that they seem not to have embarked in any sort of experimentation with these indigenous beverages, and also not with food. This reluctance to copy indigenous food and drink practices, I suspect, may have contributed significantly to the decline and fall of the Dutch conquest in Brazil. As Bruno Miranda has recently shown, and Wim Klooster corroborated, one of the main causes of the weak position of the West India Company in Brazil was the state of need in which their troops operated. Soldiers were basically dying of hunger, malnutrition, and disease. Fighting the Luso-Portuguese revolt that started in 1645 was impossible, and the Dutch lost Brazil. So while I argue that the Dutch failed in making full use of indigenous knowledge of natural resources, and also failed to interpret the ritual significance of the bebedeiras that they saw, they were careful to record all of it. So the task of interpretation is left for us. Can we find indigenous epistemologies in the HNB? Yes, I think we can. Relying too directly on these Dutch descriptions can be tricky, especially due to the multi-authored, multi-layered nature of this book. It has to be read against the grain, as we all know and do in our respective work. However, another fruitful way to find indigenous knowledge in the HNB is to look at linguistics, the old Tupi language that is abundantly present in this book. Just to take two examples that we've already seen. When the pineapple is too ripe due to the hot weather, it is not good, and they, the Tupi, call it nana cacava. There is also the nana brava, that is the wild pineapple. A careful study of these two names of plants and animals in Old Tupi may reveal alternative systems of classification. Old Tupi words contain in themselves ideas about what is good for consumption or what is bad and poisonous, what is big and what is small. In other words, about the relationship between things. We see a similar dynamic with the term for calabash, called coutier, wherein the suffix ete means the one real truth. The same thing happened when dogs were introduced in Brazil. Dogs were named jaguar in reference to the jaguar, and the jaguar itself became jaguarete, that is the real jaguar. The dog seems to have been interpreted as a smaller second-hand version of the jaguar, and for more on this, you should consult the work of anthropologist Felipe van der Velden. So that is the task that I have given myself for the next 5 years. Working together with specialists in ethnobotany, zoology, Brazilian indigenous languages, and in particular Old Tupi, museum and material culture specialists, I am going to use the HNB as a point of entry into the world of indigenous knowledge in the making of Dutch Brazil, and in the making, of course, of this seminal volume. And Mariana is happy to describe the project in more detail. Thank you.
All the technology. And I think we can open it up for questions from the audience that would get us a nice conversation going. And so I'll note your hands when you raise them. There are people with microphones and they'll come to you and you can ask the question. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we will note your hands. Rebecca?
Thank you for your talk, both of your talks. I was wondering if, Daniela, you could talk a little bit more about this concept of boundary object and how specifically it applies to the Mendoza.
Yes. I sort of slapped it on at the last minute, imparting, it as a weight of, of responding to what happened yesterday in this room and some of the conversations we had as an invitation for us to think together about the categories we're using, the analytical categories, and what can help us or not help us. So it's a category that has been very heavily used in social studies of science. It's not one that I have used very much, but that I'm thinking through. What I was hoping to get at is that whether you're looking at the Codex Mendoza or the Historia Naturalis, right? These are very complex objects, right? In which there are many different moments in their making and many different presences, and things are being it's an accretion. And so when you get the final product, you have all these different layers and all these different elements. And what I am trying to get at is not the final product, but the multiple presences. And I was wondering about whether this idea of boundary objects help us. The way that the concept came up was actually with a sort of sociological study of institutions and the a study of a natural history museum, and sort of what happens when you have an object like an animal bone, and you have different scientific communities that have different understandings of what it is, where it came from, what you do with it, what it's good for, and they debate, right? And so the specialists in X have their take on it, and the specialists on Y have their take on it, but they're all looking at the same bone, and they all can use it. And so either you destroy the object through disagreement, you say, we cannot agree. This will become such a contested object that we cannot use it as a scientific object or exhibit it in the museum. There's no label we can write for it. There's no conversation we can use. Or you find a way to stabilize it enough that different communities can use it, each for their own needs. So it's a contested object, but nobody owns it or wins it. They each use it. And when I was reading this, in thinking about sort of the sociology of scientific knowledge, it struck me as potentially a good way to think about these contested objects. The problem with the category of boundary objects is that when you really start thinking about it, there was a lot. So this idea was first introduced in 1989. So it's an old concept, and since then there was a moment where everybody went crazy and everything became a boundary object, and then it became useless as a category because it was like, well, what isn't a boundary object? And I think that the person who wrote, most helpfully for me about that was Susan Starr, who sort of returned to the concept repeatedly over time to say, who cares? That is not the point, right? It's not a taxonomic debate. It's not like, is this a boundary object or not? And we can all fight and then we decide, yes, it is, or no, it's not. The question is that a useful tool for making meaning out of that? So that's how I was throwing it up, in part in response to Barbara Fuchs' question yesterday about what are the categories that we're using to examine these objects, and what are the, not just the adjectives, but the investigative processes that we ourselves are using, right, to make meaning out of them, because I think that those determine what answers we find to a large extent.
So I have a quick follow-up, if I might, to my point yesterday.
Sorry, I was like, ooh, there's a voice somewhere.
Sorry, I was given the microphone, so I'm taking the liberty of following up. So thank you for addressing that. I was interested, Daniela, in your adding the legal into the mix, as well as this notion of boundary object, but I was struck, and this went by rather quickly, so forgive me if it's well known, I just don't know enough about it. Do we know anything about why the urgency to send to Europe, and is it in the service of a particular choral or legalistic context? So that's the first part. And then the second part is, again, thinking with you in terms of this boundary object, does it in any way remain with the Nahua, or can we speculate about a kind of cultural work that it's doing on the Nahua side, even though the material object gets sent off?
Well, I mean, so there's many people in this room who will have things to say. David, I can see your eyebrows flying. It's a, it's a totemic object almost. It's a very, very important object. I personally think that we have very little historical evidence to answer lots of questions. That to me are just, I can't pin down with a kind of precision that I would like as a historian for certain things, having to do with who made it, the year it was made, whether Mendoza Commission, none of these things are certain. So I don't think we know exactly the circumstances of its production or to be sent, but the context, the legal one, is one that has not, as far as I think, been sort of taking enough into account for the interpretation of the manuscript and what it tells us about the different context in which books are being made. I think that there's a bit of a sort of a formalist blindness, like if it looks like this, it's a book, and then, you know, there's no questions to ask, and I think that there's many kinds of books and many kinds of questions. Does it remain with the Nawa at all? I mean, it's so interesting. So there, I will say that the genre remains, not the object, right? And so that the evidentiary use of images and the idea that images are knowledge that that offers sort of a place for indigenous knowledge claims, that is definitely there before and remains. And the relaciones geográficas, the maps, right, are in a way doing that kind of thing. What is interesting is that, so, you know, the Codex is sent to Europe and then has this sort of, you know, wildlife where it is popping up in many different places and then through reproduction. And so where it continues to have a changing life is in Europe. And Johannes de Laat, who is making that chart of the coast and who is one of the directors of the Dutch West Indies Company and very interested in Brazil, is one of the people who looks at purchases edition of the Codex Mendoza and then uses it as part of this sort of European, the deployment of knowledge about the Americas as part of European imperial competition. So that's an entirely different context, but it's one in which it is operating.
We might have time for one more question. Yes?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for both wonderful presentation. A comment on Daniela's one, not on this matter, I completely agree. We do not have evidence to know the relationship with Mendoza, etc. But a point I want to stress, I found really interesting in your presentation, is this idea of the object as a set of actions. And I'd like to focus on the first two steps that you stressed, so the painting and the oral reading. You said there is the finished object and then we have a series of steps. Remaining on this more indigenous side, what I found extremely interesting in your proposal is that the first step, the painting, doesn't produce a finished object because as you surely know, the written part of Codex Mendoza doesn't contain all the information that you need to read that. The Coyoacan toponym just says Coyo, and you must know that that is Coyo. You must add some information. The reading or chanting part is something that the reader must add. He must already have that knowledge. So a painted codex, a pre-colonial painted codex, is not a finished, I would like to say is still an open object. It needs this dynamic interaction with the reader, with the chanter. And well, going back to what I was saying yesterday, you know, chanting is part of the life of the object because in itself, it lacks a lot of information. And it's interesting that there is, you may know, a very harsh debate now among interpreters of Nawa hieroglyphic writing, because the most strict interpreters, which I think they are right, they are doing a wonderful job, they are stressing, okay, here you have Hueyapan, it just says ah. The writing actually only says ah. And so other people say, no, this is a reductive interpretation, you are downplaying Nawa writing, you're just saying that Nawa writing system didn't properly reproduce language. I think the problem is not to downplaying Nawa writing, is that that writing system requires this interaction with the reader. And so I think that what you propose is absolutely important, no? And I like to think about these objects as open objects. They need to be in dialogue with the reader.
Thank you so much. And I guess what I will say is that a couple of things. It's not just, so those are data, right? Very specific individual points of information. Where I really see what is not contained by the pictorial and is added by the chanting is, like I showed you the page with Xochitl, or you see, it will show a ruler and the pictorial will have all the towns, and then the text will say he had 13 children, he was a great lover of music and dancing, he loved his first wife the best, right? That is not in the pictorial, so that they are sort of complementary modes to produce the meaning. I wonder, Davide, if part of the issue is that for contemporary interpreters, one of the central questions around this object is, can we use it, to study pictographic writing? That is not a central question for the codex. The central question for the codex is about recording certain information and making those images legible. And in the 1540s, the question is a different question from today. So it's an object that remains, not only open, but usable, interpretable, but that the questions that are asked of it now are different from then. And I guess I want to connect this to Mariana's paper in a way, because this is by no means something that is exclusive of indigenous objects. So Mariana was showing us a book that is printed in Europe based on the manuscripts of a person who has traveled and died, and that is edited by a European scholar who is very actively involved, and Mariana, maybe I'm getting this wrong, I forget if it's Piso or Markgraf who dies, but one of them dies. But anyway, so it's edited by the lad, who is, writing this book about natural history, but he is also a director of the West Indies Company, and it is doing many other publications, one of them on the Codex Mendoza. He's doing a history of the New World, and this is, applied scholarship, let's call it, as part of an imperial discourse. And in order to do it, he's taking this manuscript that comes from the ground that is capturing some indigenous words and practices as seen through the European traveler, as presented through the European scholar, and putting them in conversation with the work of Francisco Hernandez in Mexico, as seen through the publication of Francisco Jimenez, right? So that this sort of attention to process and to what that tells us about what the content can mean, for me is more general, something that I have taken as a methodology from the history of science, and about the idea that, if you're interested, are you interested in, you put something into a black box, something comes out, are you interested in what comes out, or in opening up the black box and investigating how that happens? And so that for me is the central thing, and I think it's a methodological thing, and I think it's as true for knowledge making in Europe as it is for knowledge making in a New World colonial context.
We've got Mariana.
This should work. Go for it.
Okay, so hi everyone.
Wait, hold on. Okay, try again.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me? So thank you all for your patience with this situation. But so I just wanted to briefly comment on what Daniela just said, and I guess about the lads and about the Historia Naturalis being this kind of compilation of diverse types of knowledges together. I think the challenge is really now to go beyond what we already know, that this is an European project, and a product of a very European kind of knowledge practices, and really trying to see what are the indigenous choices therein, right? Because Markgraf is for 7 years in Brazil, going on expeditions, talking to people, and of course there are things that he sees, but there are things that he doesn't understand. and there are certain practices that are not revealed to him and to Piso. So I guess what I'm trying to do, and I will try to do in the next 5 years in my project, is to really try to, how can I say this? I don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater. That's what you say in English, you know. I don't want to say this is an European product. I really want to try and kind of follow what Diana Magallanes was saying yesterday in the first session as how can I look at this as really an intercultural product and finding the indigenous voices and their choices in imparting some knowledges and others not to Margraf and to Piso. So I guess, you know, attributing everything to European choices, we know that it's enough. So I'd like to try and think about it from a different angle. But maybe that's not what you said at all, and this is just my fever speaking. So, you know.
Well, I did not say that. I understand what you're up to, and you know, I think it's great. I'm not saying these are exclusively European projects at all. What I'm saying is, you know, what Davide was calling sort of an open object, that I think the projects are very similar in a sense of like taking this object and starting to unpack it and to see, okay, where are the multiple strands, you know, what are each doing, how are they, you know, sort of, to use the word you use, entangled, you know, so what I'm saying is that methodologically we can apply this to many entangled objects, that there is
absolutely
nothing sort of, you know, that impossibilitates that based on geography.
And from the indigenous perspective, we have many examples, for example, in Zapotec documents where the writers, the Zapotec people who are producing the objects, make very careful choices about the information that they provide, even when they know that there are valuables at stake, or you know, or certain presence of Spanish officials. And so I think that this is a nice conversation to keep going, because from the native choices that we see in the documents, absolutely very carefully and selectively providing answers that will fulfill several requests from the officials, Spanish officials, and as well from the communities who seek often to protect their own properties and values. Thank you so much, everyone. I think we can continue our conversation outside in our brief break, and we'll come back in about 15 minutes. Thanks again.